hour behind time, so I am going to certainly bear that in mind as I go forward in my my presentation. I want to, of course, at this point, however, thank the Office of International Programs, with whom without this thing would not have been organized. Of course, in particular, there might be other people that I'm not aware who contributed, but Shainan and Burjanum, I would like to thank you in particular. And, of course, for being the catalyst behind this. Chennai deserves a lot of credit for this. Now, I'm going to, as I said, try to keep this limited. And my talk isn't going to be specifically on Greece or on Cyprus or on Greek-Turkish relations. Let me say this from the very beginning. I do not claim to be an expert on any of these topics. But I do some amount of work on an area that's related. And my area of work, what we can say is being my main research area, my main research interest, happens to be this issue of peace, basically. And more specifically, I'm interested in how we actually can potentially attain higher levels of peace, basically. I'll get to what I mean by that in a while. But when we look at international relations, which is basically what I do most of my work on, we don't necessarily think enough about the concept of peace, basically. And there's a lot of interesting things that we can do which we tend to ignore. We focus maybe a little bit too much in having our dependent variables as is there war or is there no war? Is there this amount of casualties, no casualties? And those are certainly interesting for us to know about. That's certainly important to know more about violence. But I'm also interested in trying to figure out what happened that led France and Germany to break out of that cycle. And many others. I mean, if you think about Russian-Turkish relations, you know, that's something that we in Turkey tend to ignore. But, you know, scholars, for example, such as Blaney, in his classic, describes Russian-Turkish relations as a vendetta, basically. The vendetta of the Black Seas refers to it. You know, we have, given this relationship, he says, which has this war every 10 years. If you think about here, of course, Ottoman Empire and the Tsarist relations, and then after a while that he says it breaks out. He has some arguments as to why the war ends, but why the cycle of war ends, which really ends up being focusing a lot on how at the end Russia just became very powerful and Turkey, well, Ottoman Empire couldn't do much about it. But that's still something. More specifically, when we think about what has happened in the post-World War II era, specifically after 60s, you know, if you think about the movement of people today, the movement of trade relations, the idea of energy ties and so on, and you know, the consideration of how nuclear power centers might be coming with considerable Russian expertise and whatnot, we can understand that something has happened in the relation. Perhaps it's not at what we can today think of French-German relations as being at, but there's something clearly qualitatively different about Russian-Turkish relations today, which probably started several decades ago, not just in the last couple of years, but something has happened there. And that's the sort of stuff that I'm interested in, basically. How do we understand what are some of the factors and this broad relationship that makes us that pushes us to force on what's going on in these cases. My focus in what I'm going to be talking to you today mainly is going to be at this country-to-country relations, basically. I'm not going to get too much into talking to you about peace within countries. I think that's a fascinating area, and I'm going to be at the very conclusion, if I do have any time, I might get to that. But basically, my very basic starting point here is to go beyond just thinking about peace as the absence of violence, which to this conference or, you know, participants should not be an issue. You know, we are here, the idea of equating peace with no war, that's a starting point again, but clearly we can go much beyond that. And there, it's both the conflict resolution literature as well as the stable peace literature that I believe give a lot of information for us to how we can work with them together. There are lots of people that we can, you know, cite here from both literatures. I'm going to unfortunately not be able to give credit to all of them, but clearly both of these literatures are in many ways related to each other. But sometimes it seems they don't talk to enough each other, and that's you know, why that happens. There's some interesting philosophy of science debates that we can get into in addition to other things. But what I end up focusing on is basically on the sort of levels of peace discussion. And what I mean by levels of peace, basically, I mean, this does get influenced a lot by some of Kelman's work, in addition, as well as others, such as Burton and others. I end up thinking about basically not just is there no war, but if there is no war, then we end up missing out very cool stuff, I would say. Think about North Korean-United States relations. Clearly there is no war. But at the same time, there's something different about North Korean-US relations from Vietnamese-American relations or Japanese-American relations. If you just look at how many years there has been no war, though, you almost get to about 50 years on each one of them, well, at least in the Korean-Japanese example. Or, of course, in the case with Turkey and its neighbors, basically, we have not the same level of, let's say, quality of relationship with each one of them. So I end up basically thinking about acceptance, how much do the sides seem to be accepting each other, the source of interactions they seem to be getting up into, the sort of interactions that they have with each other. And then I also try to think about the extent to which these incompatibilities have been resolved and how much institutionalized systems have been put in place such that if there is newer issues coming up, it's not going to necessitate basically violence as being an option, but rather other institutionalized, perhaps boring bureaucratic techniques are going to be used to overcome whatever problems might be coming out, basically. Now, this leads me basically, in one sense, to think about we can have more levels of peace, but in a very basic starting points. We can think about a very, very low level of peace, basically. I'm going to be, unfortunately, having to pass through these somewhat quickly, but a very low level of peace, I would say, indicates that the sides seem to not even be accepting each other, basically, as a real other. There's that sort of respect that was discussed at the very beginning of today, even that seems to be lacking. Let alone the extent of interactions. What interactions there are is very much state to state, as well as really hostile for the most part. And clearly, if there are incompatibilities, they're not resolved. At the other hand, we can talk about a warm peace where we can say that there is a lot of interactions, there is whatever incompatibilities have been resolved, and we have actually also clearly, as a very beginning point, we accept the other. There isn't this sort of, I do not accept your existence. And cold peace you can think of almost as a middle level. So if warm peace is my highest level in this sort of study I'm going to be presenting to you, and frozen peace is the lowest one, cold peace tends to be in this middle one where we recognize the other, but the interactions are clearly low. We have not resolved their incompatibilities if they exist. If you want more specific, concrete examples of who falls where, basically, for somewhere like German-French relations would be something today like warm peace, basically. Cold peace might be something like Egyptian-Israeli relations. And frozen peace, well, if we move to Turkey's east, basically, unfortunately, Armenia, Turkey would still today, despite that sort of initial steps, unfortunately, it was not able to move beyond that, and we would place that within that category. Or Greece and Turkey today, I would place much closer to being in the cold peace level, and frozen peace being, unfortunately, the Turkey, Cypriot, the Republic of Cyprus, and relations, or in general, the island of Cyprus, we might put there. So clearly, there is stuff that there is material here that we can focus on. Now, much of my work on this is statistically driven. I'm not going to get too much into the details of this, but the results that I'm going to be presenting to you come from some of the statistical analysis that I did, in addition to various case studies that I have done, as well as students who have participated either as high school students or university level masters or undergraduates have done over for me, in addition to my own ones. So I'm going to not give you lots of information, statistical tables. If you are interested, I can show you at the end, but this is also getting to 5 o'clock. It's been a long day, and you guys have been way more patient than I would have in many conferences our participants are, and you deserve a big hand of applause for that. But I'm going to just try to instead give you some of the findings that when I do these sort of statistical analysis, as well as think about some of the findings that come out of various case studies. And these case studies are quite broad. They don't just involve, let's say, Turkey. As I mentioned, I did do some work on Russian-Turkish relations, but they also, for example, looked at U.S.-Mexican relations, and there's some others that I did in other parts. You know, what I'm interested here then to give you a setup of what I'm going to be talking to you is, thinking about this improvement from a very low level to a medium level, and then from a medium level to a higher level. On the one hand, as well as we can always think about a deterioration, basically. So going down, basically, from a cold piece perhaps to a frozen piece, so a medium level to a very low level, or back to war, of course, is always an option with these entities that we're studying here. Now, at the very beginning of today, of course, we looked at the various sorts of dignity-related issues, and one item perhaps to consider might be, especially in a state-to-state relationship, what happened in the last war. So remember also that a lot of these findings that I'm presenting to you come from that last war's effects on things, basically. So I look at the participants that fought in a war, and then I examine their relations by collecting data on a variety of different items. Again, I can talk to you later on if you want about that. One of the things that we find is this issue of territory, which we know in international relations we speak a lot about. And actually in the surveys that was presented to us from Cyprus, that issue of territory is rather important for us. Territory has strategic importance, it has economic importance, it has beyond that a symbolic emotional importance as well. One of the things that we see, however, in this large N, what we can call analysis, is that territory matters not necessarily for keeping you at a very low level of peace, but it actually helps you for going back to war, basically. So this sort of territory's importance comes out to us. So let's say if you had a war, and in that war you lost territory, territory is not always going to make it very hard for you to perhaps improve your statistically speaking, into reaching a higher level, but it does certainly increase dramatically the chance of going back to war, basically. What we also see is this political settlement. How has this war come to an end? And this becomes interesting for us, because if you think about the conflict resolution field, most of the time we think about concepts like win-win. We think about how can we the sides create more out of the agreements, how can we win more and not win just in the sense of splitting the pie 50-50, but how can we really create more out of this? Unfortunately, we also know that many of the things that I'm studying here, if they have a negotiated settlement, it ends up being, because of the sorts of negotiation tactics and so on, really becomes almost a lose-lose situation. So that what we end up finding is that imposed settlements tend to be the ones that create sometimes longer durations, and sometimes even help to reaching higher levels of peace. Now this, of course, goes against, in one sense, what we know from the conflict resolution field, but on the other hand, this doesn't say that win-win approaches don't work. It's just that it's not being tried, and the sorts of negotiated settlements that we see might be hiding other things behind themselves, and which is making us to find that imposed settlements of a victor imposing some sort of political settlement on another works out. And let's not forget that some of these things should not always be thought about as one winner saying this is I'm getting everything and you're not getting anything, and imposing a settlement of that kind. At the end, various studies, strategic surrender by Ketchkumit and others show to us that even in cases where there's a clear-cut loser and a clear-cut winner, there might be situations where that winner does give quite a bit of things still to the loser, even if it's just gestures. The Japanese got to keep their emperor. That's ended up to being quite important for how the things were going to go on, even though at the same time their constitution wasn't really their own constitution. Those are little things that the winner can do in an imposed settlement situation.